Sometimes the deepest bonds are forged not through words, but through desperate acts of courage. In a world where companionship is rare, the connection between a man and his faithful friend can mean everything. In the American frontier, weathered cowboy Jake Harrison lived alone with only his donkey Patches for company. When spring floods created a raging torrent, Jake watched his beloved companion get swept away. Without hesitation, he plunged into the icy waters, fighting to save the drowning animal. Exhausted, Jake dragged Patches to safety, both barely alive. But what happened next brought this hardened old frontiersman to his knees in tears. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks before that fateful morning by the river, Jake Harrison had been mending fence posts along his modest homestead when he first heard the news that would change everything. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming territory, painting the grasslands in shades of gold and amber that reminded him of better days. His weathered hands worked the wire with practiced precision, each twist and pull a meditation. Born from 30 years of solitary living, Jake's cabin sat nestled against a backdrop of pine-covered hills, a humble structure he'd built with his own hands after mustering out of the cavalry in 1875. The logs bore the scars of harsh winters and blazing summers, much like the man himself. At 58, Jake carried the quiet dignity of someone who had seen the world change around him, from the chaos of war to the steady march of civilization across the frontier. Patches stood nearby, methodically working through a patch of sweet grass, his grey coat dappled with white spots that had earned him his name. The donkey possessed an intelligence that often surprised visitors, though few came this far into the wilderness anymore. Jake had won Patches in a poker game in Cheyenne 5 years prior, but their partnership had evolved into something far deeper than ownership. They were survivors, both of them, making their way in a land that demanded resilience from every living thing. The old cavalry saber that hung above Jake's fireplace caught the morning light streaming through the single window of his cabin. Lieutenant Jake Harrison had carried that blade through 3 campaigns against hostile tribes, but those days felt like another man's memories now. The saber's brass guard bore the dents and scratches of battles fought and won, yet Jake rarely looked at it anymore. Some memories were better left undisturbed, especially when the night sounds of the wilderness brought back echoes of war whoops and bugle calls. Jake's daily routine had become a comfortable rhythm over the years. Dawn brought coffee stronger than creek water and biscuits that would serve as mortar if he ever needed to patch his chimney. Patches would already be awake, ears twitching at the sound of Jake's boots on the cabin floor. The donkey had an uncanny ability to sense Jake's moods. On difficult days, when the old wounds ached or memories pressed too close, Patches would stay nearer to the cabin, offering his steady presence without demanding conversation. Their morning ritual began with Jake checking the water trough, while Patches investigated the night's changes to his territory. Jake would share his breakfast biscuit, breaking it in half with the same care his mother had once shown when dividing meals among 7 hungry children back in Ohio. Patches accepted his portion with dignified appreciation, never grabbing or pushing, always waiting for Jake's gesture of offering. The homestead itself told the story of a man learning to live with his choices. Jake had filed his claim after leaving the army, drawn to this remote valley by its isolation rather than its promise of wealth. Unlike many who came west seeking fortune, Jake sought only peace. His small herd of cattle numbered barely 20 head, enough to provide modest income when driven to market each fall. His vegetable garden produced sufficient food to last the winter, supplemented by hunting and the occasional fish from the creek that wound through his property. But it was his relationship with Patches that had truly transformed Jake from a solitary ex-soldier into something resembling contentment. The donkey possessed an almost human understanding of Jake's moods and needs. When thunderstorms rolled across the valley, Patches would position himself between Jake and the direction of the storm, as if offering protection. During the long winter months when snow blocked the mountain passes and Jake might not see another soul for weeks, Patches became his confidant and companion. Jake found himself talking to the donkey more than he'd spoken to people in years. Not the baby talk some folk used with animals, but real conversation. Observations about the weather, worries about the cattle, memories of places and people from his past. Patches would listen with remarkable attention, his large, dark eyes focused on Jake's face, occasionally offering soft grunts of acknowledgement that seemed perfectly timed to the flow of conversation. The morning routine would continue with checking the cattle, repairing whatever the previous day's wind or wandering animals had damaged, and the endless task of preparing for the next season. Jake had learned to think ahead, splitting wood for next winter during the warm months, storing food while game was plentiful, mending equipment before it broke completely. Patches participated in all of it, carrying supplies, providing companionship, and offering the kind of steady reliability that Jake had found lacking in most human relationships. As the sun climbed higher, Jake would often pause in his work to appreciate the vastness of the landscape around him. The valley stretched for miles in every direction, bounded by mountains that changed color throughout the day. Blue in the early morning, purple at sunset, white with snow through the long winter months. This was a land that could break a man's spirit or heal it, depending on what he brought to the bargain. Jake had brought his wounds and his need for solitude, and the land had responded with space enough to breathe and silence enough to think. Patches seemed to understand the rhythms of this life instinctively. He never wandered far from Jake. Never. Created problems that would complicate their simple existence. When supply runs to the distant town became necessary, Patches would carry packs with the patient endurance of a creature born to service. When Jake needed to move cattle or repair distant fence lines, Patches provided transportation and company without complaint. Their bond had been tested through harsh winters when food ran low and summer droughts when water became precious. They had weathered disease among the cattle, visits from occasionally hostile drifters, and the gradual encroachment of railroad surveyors mapping routes that would eventually bring more people into their isolated valley. Through it all, Jake and Patches had maintained their partnership, each depending on the other, in ways that went beyond the practical necessities of frontier life. The old cavalry saber above the fireplace served as a reminder of the man Jake used to be. Quick to anger, trained for violence, comfortable with conflict. That man had carried orders from superior officers and fought battles for causes larger than himself. But this new Jake, the one who shared his breakfast with a gentle donkey and talked to the mountain peaks as old friends, had found something the soldier never possessed: genuine peace. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. Jake's first years on the homestead had been marked by restlessness and occasional drinking binges, when loneliness became too heavy to bear. He'd made half-hearted attempts at courting women in the distant settlements, but those efforts felt forced and uncomfortable after so many years of military life and frontier solitude. Gradually, he'd come to accept that some men were meant for different kinds of lives, and there was no shame in choosing solitude if it brought contentment. Patches had arrived during Jake's 5th year on the homestead, at a time when Jake was questioning whether he could continue the isolation indefinitely. The donkey's calm presence had provided the missing element Jake hadn't realized he needed: companionship without judgment, loyalty without conditions, and the simple comfort of another living being who chose to stay nearby, not from duty or obligation, but from something that felt remarkably like friendship. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a mail rider whose horse looked as tired as his news was unexpected. Jake recognized the careful handwriting immediately. His sister Martha's, penmanship unchanged after 30 years of separation. He tucked the envelope into his shirt pocket without opening it, a habit formed by too many military dispatches bearing unwelcome orders. Some news improved with time, he'd learned, though. Some grew worse with delay. That envelope remained unopened 3 days later, when the spring melt began in earnest. Mountain snow that had accumulated through the bitter winter months suddenly surrendered to an unseasonably warm April sun, sending torrents of water rushing down every gulch and draw toward the valley floor. Jake had seen spring floods before, but this year's snowpack had been heavier than most, and the thaw came with unusual intensity. The creek that normally meandered peacefully through Jake's property transformed overnight into a churning brown torrent twice its usual width. By dawn of the fourth day, the sound of rushing water had grown from a gentle murmur to an ominous roar that penetrated even the thick log walls of Jake's cabin. Patches stood at the edge of their usual watering spot, head cocked in puzzlement. At the transformed landscape, Jake emerged from the cabin to find his familiar world altered beyond recognition. The gentle creek had become a raging river, carrying uprooted trees and debris from upstream. Water had risen to within feet of his cabin, higher than he'd ever seen in his decades on the property. His cattle huddled on a small rise of ground that formed an island in the expanding flood, lowing anxiously at their shrinking refuge. "Easy there, partner," Jake murmured to Patches, who had backed away from the water's edge with unusual caution. The donkey's ears twitched nervously, and he stayed closer to Jake than usual, clearly unsettled by the dramatic change to their familiar environment. Jake spent the morning moving essential supplies to higher ground, anticipating that the water might continue rising throughout the day. His father's pocket watch, passed down through 3 generations of Harrison men, went into a waterproof pouch, along with his few important papers and the still unopened letter from Martha. Some possessions were too precious to risk to the floods. Uncertain appetite. The real crisis began just past midday. Jake was securing his woodpile when he heard a sound that froze his blood. Patches' distressed braying, sharp with panic and fear. Jake spun toward the sound and saw a sight that stopped his heart. Patches had ventured too close to the water's edge, probably investigating something that caught his curiosity. When the undermined bank gave way beneath his hooves, the donkey fell into the torrent with a splash that seemed impossibly small given the magnitude of the disaster. The current immediately seized him, sweeping him downstream faster than Jake could have imagined possible. Patch's head bobbed above the surface, his eyes wide with terror as he fought desperately to keep his muzzle above the brown, churning water. Jake ran along the bank, crashing through brush and leaping over fallen logs in a desperate attempt to keep pace with his drowning companion. His heart hammered against his ribs as he watched Patches struggle against the merciless current, the donkey's strength visibly ebbing with each passing second. The water carried him toward a bend in the creek, where standing trees created a maze of deadly obstacles. Without conscious thought, Jake plunged into the icy torrent. The shock of the cold water hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and sending needles of pain through every nerve. The current grabbed him immediately, spinning him downstream with the same ruthless efficiency that had captured Patches. Jake fought to control his trajectory, using every skill learned during river crossings in his cavalry days. The water was shockingly cold, snowmelt from the high peaks that had never known the warmth of summer sun. Jake's heavy boots and winter clothing dragged at him, threatening to pull him under with their waterlogged weight. But ahead of him, barely visible through the spray and debris, Patches continued his desperate struggle for survival. Jake angled toward the donkey, swimming with powerful strokes that burned his shoulders and arms. Years of physical labor had maintained his strength, but the current seemed determined to keep them apart. Every time he gained ground, the river would spin him sideways or slam him against a submerged log, setting him back precious yards. A fallen cottonwood created a momentary eddy in the current, and Jake seized the opportunity to grab Patch's halter just as the exhausted animal began to sink beneath the surface. The donkey's weight, increased by his waterlogged hide and the river's drag, nearly pulled Jake under as well. For a terrifying moment, both man and animal disappeared beneath the muddy water. Jake surfaced first, gasping and spitting river water, his grip on Patches's halter, the only thing preventing both of them from being swept away. The donkey's head emerged a second later, his nostrils flaring as he fought for air. His dark eyes, usually so calm and intelligent, showed the wild panic of a creature facing death. Swimming toward shore while supporting Patches required strength Jake wasn't certain he possessed. Every stroke was agony, his muscles screaming. In protest, as the cold water sapped his energy, the bank seemed impossibly distant, and the current fought their every movement toward safety. Patches had stopped struggling, conserving his remaining strength or perhaps losing consciousness. Jake couldn't tell which, and both possibilities terrified him. Progress came in agonizing increments. Jake would gain a few yards toward shore, only to lose ground when the current caught them in a particularly vicious eddy. His lungs burned with the effort of keeping both their heads above water, and his fingers were growing numb from cold and strain. The familiar landscape of his homestead rushed past them, transformed into an alien waterscape he barely recognized. A submerged fence post provided the anchor Jake needed. His free hand closed around the wood with desperate strength, and he used the fixed point to drag both himself and Patches toward the flooded bank. The final yards to safety required every remaining ounce of his strength, but Jake refused to consider failure. He had already lost too much in his life to surrender his closest companion to the river's hunger. When Jake's boots finally found purchase on solid ground, he collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, still clutching Patches' halter. The donkey lay on his side in the shallow water at the bank's edge, his flanks heaving with exhaustion. For several terrifying seconds, Jake wasn't certain whether Patches was breathing or simply shuddering from the cold. Then the donkey lifted, his head slightly, water streaming from his nostrils, and Jake felt relief flood through him more powerfully than the river that had nearly claimed them both. They had survived, both of them, though Jake wasn't sure how. His entire body shook with cold and adrenaline, and his waterlogged clothes clung to him like a second skin of ice. The familiar sounds of his homestead, birds calling, wind in the pine trees, cattle lowing on their temporary island, seemed muted after the roar of the flood. Jake helped Patches struggle to his feet, supporting the donkey's weight until his legs steadied beneath him. They stood together on the muddy bank, two survivors of a disaster that had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, but felt like a lifetime as Jake looked at his faithful companion, still trembling from their ordeal. He realized something had fundamentally changed between them. The casual companionship of their daily routine had been transformed by shared terror and mutual dependence into something deeper and more profound. Jake had risked his life to save Patches, but in that desperate moment in the river, he understood that Patches represented far more than simple companionship. He was Jake's connection to life itself, to purpose and meaning in a world that often offered neither. But even as relief washed over him, Jake sensed that their trial was far from over. Jake's hands shook as he led Patches toward the cabin, though whether from cold or delayed shock, he couldn't say. Every step on the muddy ground felt uncertain, as if the solid earth beneath his feet had become as unreliable as the river that had nearly claimed them both. The familiar path to his front door seemed longer than usual. Each yard covered a small victory against the trembling in his legs. Inside the cabin, Jake immediately went to his trunk and pulled out the thick wool blanket that had served him through 3 winters of military campaigns. The deep blue fabric, though faded and bearing the scars of decades of use, still held the warmth trapping properties that had kept him alive during bitter nights on the frontier. His sergeant's stripes, though long since removed, had left their shadow in the weave, a ghost of authority from another lifetime. Patches stood quietly while Jake rubbed him down with the military blanket, the donkey's usual alertness replaced. by exhaustion that seemed to penetrate his very bones. Jake worked methodically, his movements driven by practical necessity, but guided by something deeper, a desperate need to restore warmth and life to his companion. The rhythmic motion of his hands across Patch's hide became a meditation, each stroke a small prayer of gratitude for their survival. "Easy now, partner," Jake murmured, his voice still hoarse from swallowing river water. "We're going to get you warm and dry. You're safe now." The words were as much for his own reassurance as for Patch's comfort. Speaking aloud in the aftermath of trauma felt necessary, a way to anchor himself to the present moment and ward off the terrible images that threatened to replay endlessly in his mind. As Jake worked, he found himself studying Patch's with new eyes. The donkey's patient endurance during the rubdown revealed characteristics Jake had somehow overlooked during their years together. The intelligent curve of Patch's neck, the way his ears swiveled to track Jake's movements even in exhaustion, the gentle acceptance of care without resistance or complaint. These weren't merely the traits of a well-trained animal, but something approaching genuine trust and affection. The realization hit Jake with unexpected force. He loved this creature, not with the casual fondness of a man for a useful animal, but with something approaching the deep affection he'd once felt for his younger brother before consumption claimed him 30 years ago. The thought unsettled Jake, challenging assumptions about himself that he'd held for decades. He'd chosen solitude deliberately, convinced that emotional attachments brought only pain and loss. Yet here he was, shaking with relief over the survival of a donkey who had somehow become central to his world. Jake built up the fire until the cabin filled with welcome warmth, then prepared hot coffee with hands that gradually stopped trembling. The familiar ritual of measuring grounds and waiting for water to boil provided comfort through its very ordinariness. Outside, the flood continued its rampage, but inside the cabin, human routine reasserted its claim against chaos and uncertainty. Patches settled near the fireplace with a soft grunt of contentment, the military blanket draped across his back. Like a badge of honor, Jake found himself unable to stop glancing at the donkey, as if ensuring that the rescue had been real and not some desperate hallucination born from hypothermia and fear. Each rise and fall of Patch's breathing reassured him that they had indeed cheated death together. The unopened letter from Martha seemed to mock Jake from its position on the mantelpiece. He'd been carrying it for days, unable to face whatever news it contained. But the morning's crisis had put his avoidance into perspective. If losing Patches had taught him anything, it was that postponing important connections only increased the pain when loss became inevitable. With hands that know longer shook, Jake retrieved the letter and settled into his wooden chair beside the fire. Patches opened one eye to observe him, then resumed his rest with the confidence of an animal who knew he was safe and valued. The envelope opened easily, revealing 3 pages of careful script that carried news from a world Jake had deliberately left behind. Martha's letter began with apologies for the long silence, explanations for the difficulty of tracking down his address, and gentle reproaches for his failure to maintain contact with family. But the heart of her message struck Jake like a physical blow. Their father was dying, peacefully but certainly, and had been asking for his middle son, the one who disappeared into the Western Territories 30 years ago and never written. Home. Jake read the letter twice before its full meaning penetrated his consciousness. His father, the stern disciplinarian who'd taught him to ride and shoot and stand up to bullies, lay dying in the old farmhouse in Ohio. The man who'd given him the cavalry saber and the pocket watch, who'd stood silent and proud when Jake left. For the war, who'd never written, but had apparently never stopped wondering about his soldier son's fate. The weight of 30 years of silence pressed down on Jake like a physical burden. He'd convinced himself that his family had forgotten him, had moved on with their lives, and found peace without the complications his presence might bring. But Martha's letter suggested otherwise, suggested that his absence had left wounds that time had never quite healed. Patches stirred near the fireplace, lifting his head to study Jake with those remarkably expressive eyes. The donkey seemed to sense the change in Jake's mood, the shift from relief over their survival to something deeper and more complex. Jake reached out to stroke the graying muzzle, finding comfort in the simple contact with his faithful companion. "What do you think, old friend?" Jake asked quietly. "Should a man try to make things right before it's too late?" Patches regarded him steadily, offering no easy answers, but providing the steady presence that had become so precious to Jake's daily existence. The flood outside continued its rampage, but inside the cabin, Jake confronted a different kind of deluge. 30 years of accumulated regrets and avoided responsibilities. His father's mortality forced recognition of his own aging, his own limited time to repair damaged relationships and honor the bonds that had shaped his early life. Yet the thought of leaving Patches, even temporarily, filled him with anxiety he hadn't expected. Their shared ordeal in the river had revealed the depth of connection Jake hadn't allowed himself to acknowledge. Patches wasn't simply a useful animal or pleasant companion. He had become Jake's anchor to hope and meaning in a life that might otherwise drift toward empty routine. The prospect of separation, even for the worthy purpose of reconciling with his dying father, felt like another kind of drowning. Jake stared into the fire, watching flames dance across the seasoned wood, and wondered when his capacity for love had quietly returned. The soldier who'd built this cabin had been convinced that emotional isolation was strength, that independence was safety. But the man, warming himself by this fire, understood that love, however painful and complicated, was what separated mere survival from genuine life. The decision forming in his mind felt both inevitable and terrifying. The old daguerreotype lay, wrapped in oiled cloth at the bottom of Jake's trunk, protected from moisture and time by the same careful attention he'd once given to maintaining his military equipment. He hadn't looked at the photograph in over a decade, but Martha's letter had awakened memories he'd thought safely buried. His hands moved through the familiar contents of the trunk: spare ammunition, winter gloves, a Bible his mother had pressed into his hands before he left for war, until his fingers found the smooth metal case. The photograph showed the Harrison family gathered on the front porch of their Ohio farmhouse in 1863, just weeks before Jake's departure for military service. His father stood behind the seated women, one hand resting on his wife's shoulder in a gesture of protection and pride. Jake's mother held baby Samuel, while Martha and young Thomas flanked them with the serious expressions children wore for formal portraits. Jake himself stood at the edge of the group, already in his new Union uniform, looking impossibly young despite his efforts to appear mature and ready for war. Studying the faces now, Jake was struck by how much hope the photograph contained. His father's expression held confidence in his son's abilities and pride in his service to country. His mother's eyes showed worry barely concealed beneath motherly courage. His siblings looked at their older brother with undisguised admiration for his uniform and the adventure it represented. None of them could have imagined that this farewell portrait would become their last shared moment. The war that seemed so righteous and brief in prospect had stretched into years of brutal carnage that transformed the idealistic young man in the photograph into someone his family might not recognize. Jake traced his finger along the glass, covering his father's image, noting the strong jawline and steady gaze that he'd inherited along with the pocket watch and cavalry saber. Patches shifted position near the fire, drawing Jake's attention back to the present. The donkey had recovered much of his strength, though he remained closer to the cabin than usual, perhaps understanding that the flood outside continued to pose dangers they'd barely survived once. Jake watched his companion with new awareness of how completely their lives had become intertwined over the past 5 years. The practical questions surrounding Martha's request seemed almost insurmountable. The journey to Ohio would require at least 6 weeks of travel, assuming railroad connections worked smoothly and weather cooperated. Leaving Patches behind felt unthinkable, yet traveling with a donkey would complicate every aspect of the trip and significantly increase both time and expense. More troubling than logistics was Jake's recognition of how much he'd changed during his years of isolation. The social skills required for traveling among strangers, staying in hotels, navigating crowded towns, these abilities had atrophied through disuse until Jake questioned whether he could function in civilized society. His clothes, his mannerisms, his speech patterns had all adapted to frontier life, where directness and self-reliance mattered more than social graces. Jake rose from his chair and moved to the window, watching the flood's continued assault on his familiar landscape. The water had begun to recede slightly, revealing muddy scars where the torrent had carved new channels and deposited debris in unlikely places. His cattle remained stranded on their shrinking island, but they appeared calm enough for the moment. The damage to his property would require weeks of repair work, assuming he stayed to complete it. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through Jake's brooding. Through the window, he watched a lone rider pick his way carefully along the edge of the flood, leading a packhorse loaded with supplies. Jake recognized Tom Brennan, the mail carrier who served the scattered homesteads throughout the valley. Tom's presence suggested either emergency or unusual news, since he normally avoided travel during dangerous weather. Jake opened his door as Tom reached the cabin, noting the careful way the older man studied the flood damage before dismounting. "Afternoon, Jake," Tom called out, his voice carrying the weariness of difficult travel. "Heard you might have had some trouble with the high water." "Nothing that won't dry out eventually," Jake replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "What brings you out in this mess?" Tom secured his horses before answering, his movements deliberate and economical. "Got word from town that the railroad's looking for men willing to sell their claims. Seems they're planning a route through this valley, and they're offering serious money for the right parcels." The news struck Jake like cold water. Railroad. Development would transform the isolated valley that had provided him sanctuary for decades. What was now wilderness accessible only to the hardiest settlers would become a corridor for commerce and settlement, bringing crowds of strangers and the complications of civilization he deliberately avoided. "They mention any specific properties?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Yours is on their list," Tom confirmed, along with the Mackenzie place upstream and the widow Peterson's land near the river bend. "They're offering enough money to set a man up comfortable anywhere he'd care to go." Jake invited Tom inside to dry off and warm himself, automatically extending the hospitality that frontier life demanded. Patches regarded the visitor with polite interest, but remained near the fire, still recovering from his morning ordeal. Tom accepted coffee and commented on the donkey's unusual calm demeanor, unaware of the drama that had played out hours earlier. As Tom talked about railroad plans and development schedules, Jake found his mind wandering to possibilities he hadn't considered before the morning's rescue. The money from selling his homestead could finance his journey to Ohio and provide resources for whatever came afterward. If his father was truly dying, Jake's presence during those final weeks might matter more than maintaining his claim on land that would soon be overrun with railroad workers and settlers. Yet the thought of deliberately abandoning the life he'd built, of choosing to leave rather than being forced out by circumstances, felt like betrayal of something sacred. This valley had healed his war wounds and provided the solitude necessary for rebuilding his spirit. The cabin, the familiar routines, the seasonal rhythms of frontier life, these had become integral to his identity in ways he was only beginning to understand. Tom mentioned that the railroad representatives would be visiting the valley within the month to make formal offers and survey their preferred route. The timeline created pressure Jake hadn't expected, compressing his decision from a theoretical possibility into an immediate necessity. If he was going to see his father alive, he would need to leave soon, regardless of flood damage or property considerations. After Tom continued on his rounds, Jake sat beside Patches and tried to envision their future together. The donkey deserved better than to be dragged across the country to satisfy his human companion's family obligations, yet leaving Patches behind felt like abandoning the one relationship that had brought genuine meaning to Jake's later years. The photograph of his family lay on the table beside Martha's letter, two artifacts from his past that demanded difficult choices about his future. Jake studied his father's face in the old daguerreotype, seeing strength and character that had shaped his early years, then looked at Patch's patient expression and saw the loyalty that had sustained his middle age. Somewhere in the balance between those relationships lay the answer to what kind of man Jake Harrison intended to be for whatever years remained to him. The railroad timetable that Tom Brennan had left behind lay spread across Jake's kitchen table like a map to another world. The neat columns of departure times and station names represented a network of civilization that had expanded dramatically since Jake's last interaction with passenger trains during his military service. Denver, Omaha, Chicago, Cleveland, cities that existed in Jake's memory as wartime supply depots now appeared as regular stops on scheduled routes that could carry him back to Ohio within days rather than weeks. Jake traced the proposed route with his finger, calculating distances and connections while Patches dozed peacefully near the fire. The flood had receded enough to reveal the extent of damage to the homestead, torn fencing, scattered debris, and erosion that would require extensive repair. Yet instead of planning reconstruction, Jake found himself studying travel schedules and estimating costs for a journey he hadn't definitively decided to undertake. The old steamer trunk that had belonged to Jake's father sat in the cabin's corner, serving as an end table beneath years of accumulated dust and neglect. Jake had carried it west after the war, filled with civilian clothes he'd barely worn and keepsakes from his family life. Opening it now released the scent of camphor and old leather, along with memories he'd successfully avoided for decades. Inside the trunk, Jake discovered artifacts from the man he'd been before isolation transformed him into something else entirely. His best suit, though decades out of fashion, remained in serviceable condition. A pocket Bible, inscribed with his mother's flowing script, reminded him of Sunday services in the little church where he'd been baptized. Letters from friends who died in the war lay tied with ribbon, their enthusiasm for adventure and service now heartbreaking in its innocence. Most significantly, Jake found his father's detailed journals from the family's original journey west to Ohio in 1832. Written in the same careful handwriting that Jake had inherited, the journals documented the elder Harrison's decision to move his young family from Pennsylvania to the Ohio frontier. Reading his father's words now, Jake was struck by parallels between their experiences. Both men choosing to leave familiar surroundings for unknown territories, both seeking something that established communities couldn't provide. His father had written extensively about the difficulty of leaving extended family behind, the practical challenges of long-distance travel with small children, and the emotional cost of abandoning relationships that might never be restored. Yet the journals also revealed deep satisfaction in building something new, in testing himself against unfamiliar challenges, in discovering capabilities he'd never suspected he possessed. Jake read until the fire burned low, absorbing his father's philosophy of life through entries that spanned several years of frontier settlement. The older man had clearly struggled with doubts about his decisions, particularly during harsh winters when isolation became dangerous and social connections seemed precious beyond measure. But he'd also found profound meaning in self-reliance and the satisfaction of creating stability through his own efforts. One passage in particular resonated with Jake's current dilemma. A man discovers his true character not in comfort and routine, But in moments when familiar supports fall away and he must choose what truly matters, the courage required for such choices increases with age, as we accumulate more to lose and less time to recover from mistakes. Patches stirred as Jake closed the journals, the donkey's internal clock telling him that evening feeding time approached, despite the day's unusual events. Jake prepared their simple meal while contemplating the parallels between his father's journey to Ohio and his own potential journey back. Both involved leaving behind hard-won security for uncertain prospects. Both required faith in relationships that time and distance had tested. As he shared his biscuit with Patches, Jake found himself speaking aloud the thoughts that had been churning through his mind since Martha's letter arrived. The old man's dying partner, and I haven't seen him since the war ended. 30 years of silence because I was too proud to write and too scared to go home. Patches accepted his portion of biscuit with dignified patience, his dark eyes focused on Jake's face with the kind of attention that suggested genuine understanding. Jake had grown accustomed to these one-sided conversations, but tonight they felt different, more like a consultation between equals than a man talking to his animal. The railroad wants this land, and maybe that's a sign that it's time to move on anyway, Jake continued. But what happens to you if I go back east? What happens to us? The questions hung in the air like smoke from the dying fire, unanswerable, but demanding consideration nonetheless. Jake had begun to understand that his connection to Patches represented more than simple companionship or practical partnership. The donkey had become his link to the capacity for love and care that military service and frontier isolation had nearly extinguished. Patches had proven that Jake was still capable of tenderness, still able to put another's welfare before his own immediate comfort. The morning's rescue had revealed the depth of that connection in ways Jake was still processing. He'd risked his life without hesitation, driven by instincts he'd thought civilized out of him years ago. The willingness to die for another creature, whether human or animal, suggested reserves of emotional commitment that contradicted Jake's self-image as a man who'd chosen independence over all other values. Outside, coyotes called across the flood-damaged valley, their voices carrying notes of wildness and freedom that Jake envied. They adapted to changing conditions through migration and flexibility, never becoming so attached to particular territories that they couldn't abandon them when circumstances demanded. Yet Jake had watched the same pack for several years now, noting their loyalty to familiar hunting grounds and denning areas. Even wild creatures formed attachments that constrained their choices. The practical preparations for traveling to Ohio would be complex, but manageable. Jake's cattle could be sold to neighboring ranches, his equipment and furniture either stored or disposed of according to their value. The cabin itself would likely be demolished by railroad construction crews, so there was little point in extensive maintenance or protection. But deciding what to do about Patches required wisdom Jake wasn't certain he possessed. The donkey was healthy and intelligent enough to adapt to new circumstances, yet the bond between them had been forged through years of shared routine and mutual dependence. Separation might be traumatic for both of them, regardless of how carefully Jake arranged alternative care. As the evening deepened into night, Jake found himself considering options he'd never imagined before the morning's crisis. Perhaps the railroad's interest in his land represented opportunity rather than unwelcome change. Perhaps Martha's letter had arrived at exactly the right moment to force decisions he'd been avoiding through habit and fear. The photograph of his family seemed to watch him from the table. 5 faces from his past, offering no easy answers, but reminding him of responsibilities that transcended personal comfort. His father had raised him to honor family obligations and to face difficult choices with courage rather than avoidance. Jake banked the fire and settled into his bed, with Patches resting nearby in a position that allowed him to monitor the door and windows. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as the flood continued to recede and reveal the full extent of damage to their small world. But tonight, Jake allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to see his father again after 30 years of silence. The train ticket lay on Jake's kitchen table like a small yellow promise, its printed destination, Chicago, Illinois, marking the first concrete step toward a reunion he'd avoided for 3 decades. He'd ridden to town 2 days after the flood, leaving Patches in the care of his neighbor Ben Mackenzie while conducting business that felt both inevitable and terrifying. The telegraph office had been Jake's first stop, where he'd composed and revised a brief message to Martha 3 times before finding words that conveyed both his intentions and his uncertainty. Letter received. Father still living. Will attempt journey within fortnight. Jake. The operator, a young man who probably hadn't been born when Jake first settled in the valley, had assured him that replies typically arrived within 24 hours. At the railroad office, Jake had studied maps and schedules until his eyes ached, calculating the fastest route to Ohio while considering alternatives that might accommodate traveling with Patches. The ticket agent, experienced in handling the complex logistics of westward migration, had been bluntly discouraging about bringing livestock on passenger trains. Freight cars, maybe, if you're shipping cattle, he'd said. But a single donkey? That's more trouble than most lines want to handle. The return journey to his homestead had been filled with second thoughts and growing anxiety. Patches had greeted him with obvious relief, staying closer than usual during the evening routine, as if sensing that their familiar world was shifting towards something uncertain. Jake had found himself studying his companion with new intensity, memorizing details that he'd taken for granted during their years together. Martha's response had arrived the following morning, carried by the same mail rider who'd brought news of the railroad's interest. Father weakening daily, but alert. Prays constantly for your safe journey. Come quickly. Love, M. The telegram's urgency had eliminated Jake's remaining hesitation about leaving, though it had sharpened his anxiety about what he might find at the end of his journey. Ben Mackenzie had offered to purchase Jake's cattle at fair market price, understanding that forced sales rarely benefited the seller, but recognizing the circumstances that demanded immediate action. More significantly, Ben had volunteered to care for Patches during Jake's absence, an offer that represented both practical solution and emotional torment for Jake. That donkey's got more sense than most people I know, Ben had said while examining the animal with an expert eye. He'll settle in fine with my stock, and you won't have to worry about him while you're dealing with family matters. The arrangement was logical and generous, yet Jake felt like he was betraying a trust that went deeper than ownership or custody. Preparing for departure forced Jake to confront how completely his life had become organized around Patch's presence and needs. His daily routines, his work schedules, his social interactions, all had evolved to accommodate and include his 4-legged companion. The prospect of weeks or months without that steady presence created an emptiness Jake hadn't expected. The military trunk that had belonged to his father became the repository for Jake's traveling possessions. His best suit, though dated, would serve for the formal occasions that family reunions and funeral preparations might demand. The cavalry saber and his father's pocket watch would travel with him as tangible connections to family history and military service. Martha's letters and the old family photograph would provide conversation starters and proof of identity for relatives who might struggle to recognize the weathered frontiersman he'd become. Most difficult to pack were the small mementos of his life with Patches, a spare halter, a curry brush worn smooth by years of use, a small collection of smooth stones the donkey had seemed to particularly enjoy examining. These items served no practical purpose for the journey ahead, yet Jake couldn't bring himself to leave them behind entirely. As Jake worked through preparations, he found his mind returning to conversations with Patches that had taken place over their years together. The donkey had been Jake's confessor and confidant, the recipient of fears and hopes that Jake had never shared with another human being. Patches had listened to rambling accounts of Jake's war experiences, patient descriptions of nightmares that sometimes woke them both, and gradual revelations of the loneliness that had driven Jake to seek extreme isolation. The depth of that communication surprised Jake as he reflected on it. He'd grown accustomed to reading Patch's moods and responses with remarkable accuracy, while the donkey had developed an almost uncanny ability to anticipate Jake's needs and emotional states. Their partnership had evolved into something approaching telepathy, a non-verbal understanding that transcended the normal boundaries between human and animal. Ben arrived the morning of Jake's departure, driving a wagon that would transport him to the railroad depot in town. The older rancher handled the transition with tactful efficiency, understanding the emotional difficulty of the separation without forcing conversation about subjects too personal for comfortable discussion. Patches allowed himself to be loaded into the wagon with resignation rather than enthusiasm, his intelligent eyes tracking Jake's movements with obvious concern. The journey to town passed in relative silence, broken only by Ben's occasional observations about weather conditions and railroad schedules. Jake sat in the wagon bed beside Patches, one hand resting on the donkey's neck in a gesture of comfort that benefited both of them. The familiar landscape of their valley looked different from this perspective, less like home and more like territory being abandoned. At the depot, Jake supervised the transfer of his luggage, while Patches was led to Ben's wagon for the return journey. The moment of final separation arrived with startling suddenness, leaving Jake standing on the platform while his closest companion disappeared around a bend in the road. The empty feeling in his chest suggested that he'd left something essential behind, something that might prove impossible to recover. The eastbound train arrived with mechanical precision, its black locomotive and passenger cars representing everything that Jake's isolated life had rejected: schedules, crowds, destinations, determined by others' priorities. Yet climbing aboard felt like the first honest decision he'd made in years, an acknowledgement that some obligations transcended personal comfort or preference. As the train pulled away from the depot, Jake caught a final glimpse of the valley that had sheltered him for 3 decades. From this distance, the flood damage was invisible, the landscape appearing peaceful and eternal rather than threatened by railroad development and inevitable change. But Jake knew that appearances could be deceiving, that even the most stable-seeming circumstances were subject to forces beyond individual control. The train's rhythm gradually settled into a hypnotic cadence that carried Jake toward a confrontation with his past and an uncertain future. In his coat pocket, Martha's telegram reminded him of the urgency that had forced this journey, while his father's pocket watch marked time with the same steady precision that had measured decades of separation. Somewhere behind him, Patches was learning to live without the daily companionship that had defined both their lives for 5 years. Somewhere ahead, Jake's dying father waited for a reunion that might heal old wounds or reveal that some distances were too great for even love to bridge. The train carried Jake into the gathering dusk, each mile of track taking him further from the life he'd known and closer to the man he'd once been. The second telegram arrived at the Chicago depot just as Jake's connecting train was preparing for departure to Cleveland. A uniformed station agent approached his seat with the yellow envelope, apologizing for the delay, while Jake's heart sank at the sight of another urgent message. In his experience, good news rarely traveled by telegram, and the timing suggested complications he hadn't anticipated. Jake's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope, expecting news about his father's condition or perhaps changes to Martha's travel arrangements. Instead, Ben Mackenzie's words hit him like a physical blow. Patches injured badly, tried to follow your scent trail, got caught in railroad equipment, near construction site. Veterinary surgeon says maybe 2 days left. Sorry, friend. Come home if you can. Ben. The world around Jake seemed to telescope into a narrow tunnel focused entirely on the telegram's brutal message. The noise of the busy depot faded to a distant murmur, and the other passengers preparing for departure became indistinct figures in a drama that no longer included him. His faithful companion, the creature who had become more family than any blood relative, was dying alone, while Jake traveled toward obligations that suddenly seemed abstract and meaningless. Jake read the telegram 3 times, hoping to find some misinterpretation in Ben's carefully chosen words, but the message remained devastatingly clear. Patches had somehow escaped Ben's care and attempted to follow Jake's trail, probably guided by scent and the powerful bond that had connected them for 5 years. The donkey's loyalty had led him directly into the path of railroad construction, equipment that was already reshaping their valley. The irony was almost unbearable. Jake had left Patches behind to avoid exactly this kind of dangerous situation, yet his departure had created the circumstances that led to the accident. If he had remained on his homestead or found a way to bring Patches on the journey, his companion would be safe. Instead, Jake's decision to honor family duty had endangered the relationship that had brought the deepest meaning to his adult life. The conductor's call for final boarding echoed through the station, but Jake remained. Frozen in his seat, the telegram clutched in his white-knuckled fingers. Around him, other passengers gathered their belongings and moved toward the train that would carry them east toward their various destinations. Jake faced a choice that seemed impossible: continue toward his dying father in Ohio, or return to his dying companion in Wyoming. The practical considerations were overwhelming. Returning to Wyoming would require at least 4 days of travel, assuming railroad connections worked perfectly and no delays interrupted his journey. Ben's telegram suggested that Patches had perhaps 2 days to live, making it mathematically unlikely that Jake could reach him in time. Meanwhile, his father's condition was also deteriorating, and the opportunity for reconciliation might pass if Jake delayed his arrival in Ohio. Yet as Jake sat in the Chicago depot, surrounded by the bustle of strangers pursuing their own urgent business, he realized that the mathematics of time and distance mattered less than the mathematics of the heart. His relationship with Patches was immediate and vital, built through daily interaction and mutual dependence. His relationship with his father existed primarily in memory and obligation, complicated by 30 years of silence and guilt. Jake rose from his seat and approached the ticket window, where a harried clerk was dealing with the usual complications of missed connections and changed travel plans. "I need to change my destination," Jake said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "Instead of Cleveland, I need to get back to Wyoming as quickly as possible." The clerk studied Jake's ticket and consulted his schedules with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd handled similar requests countless times. "That's going to be expensive," he warned, "and complicated. You'll need to backtrack through Denver, and there's no guarantee about connections to your local depot." "Money's not the problem," Jake replied, thinking of the funds he'd received from selling his cattle. "Time is the problem. What's the fastest route you can arrange?" As the clerk worked through the logistics of Jake's changed travel plans, Jake found himself composing a telegram to Martha that would be almost as difficult to send as it was to write. How could he explain that he was abandoning their dying father for the sake of a donkey most people would consider a replaceable animal? How could he make her understand that Patches represented his only successful attempt at love and loyalty since the war had damaged his capacity for human connection? The westbound train that would carry Jake back toward Wyoming departed Chicago 3 hours later, its delay caused by mechanical problems that seemed designed to test his already strained patience. Jake spent those hours walking the depot platforms, reading Ben's telegram repeatedly, and struggling with doubts about his decision that grew stronger with each passing minute. By choosing Patches over his father, Jake was revealing something about himself that he'd never fully acknowledged. Despite 30 years of guilt and Martha's heartfelt pleas, his capacity for family connection had been irreparably damaged by war and isolation. But his capacity for love hadn't been destroyed. It had simply found a different object, one that asked nothing of him except presence and care. The train's westward journey became a race against time that Jake feared he was destined to lose. Each stop, each delay, each mile of track represented precious minutes that Patches might not possess. Jake found himself calculating and recalculating travel times, as if mathematical precision could somehow influence biological processes beyond his control. Fellow passengers occasionally attempted conversation, but Jake's preoccupation with his desperate mission made normal social interaction impossible. He stared out train windows at landscape that gradually transformed from eastern farmland to western plains, each geographical change marking his progress toward a reunion that might come too late to matter. During the long night hours when sleep proved impossible, Jake reflected on the relationship that had driven him to abandon family duty for animal loyalty. Patches had never demanded anything from him except basic care and occasional companionship. The donkey had accepted Jake's moods, tolerated his silences, and offered unwavering constancy through seasons of doubt and loneliness that might otherwise have driven him to despair. In choosing Patches over his father, Jake was acknowledging that love earned through daily interaction mattered more to him than love assumed through blood relation. The recognition was both liberating and terrifying, suggesting that his years of isolation had fundamentally changed his priorities in ways that most people would find incomprehensible. The telegram from Martha that was waiting at the Denver depot confirmed Jake's worst fears about the consequences of his choice. Father passed peacefully yesterday evening. Funeral planned for Thursday. Your absence noted but understood. Travel safely. Love, M. The message was characteristically gracious, but Jake understood the disappointment and hurt that lay beneath Martha's careful words. His father had died while Jake raced across the continent toward a different deathbed, one that most people would consider insignificant compared to the loss of a parent. Yet Jake felt no regret about his decision, only a deepening urgency to reach Patches before their own opportunity for farewell passed beyond recovery. The final train that would carry Jake to the depot nearest his homestead was delayed by weather conditions that seemed designed to test his faith in Providence. As Jake waited on the platform in Denver, clutching Ben's telegram and his father's pocket watch, he understood that his choice had revealed the man he'd become during his years of frontier isolation. He was no longer the dutiful son who had left Ohio 30 years ago, nor the disciplined soldier who had served his country with honor. He had become something else entirely, a man whose deepest loyalties had been reshaped by love that transcended conventional boundaries between species and expectations. The local depot sat empty, except for a sleeping clerk, when Jake's train finally arrived at 3 a.m, 2 days after receiving Ben's telegram. The delay had been caused by a rock slide that blocked the tracks for 6 hours. 6 hours that might have meant the difference between reunion and regret. Jake's traveling bag felt impossibly heavy as he walked through the dark station, though it contained nothing more than the possessions he'd thought essential for reconciling with his family. His father's compass, the brass instrument that had guided the elder Harrison through his own journey west decades earlier, had become Jake's talisman during the desperate return trip. He'd consulted it obsessively during train delays, as if the magnetic needle could somehow point him toward Patches as effectively as it had once pointed toward true north. The compass face, worn smooth by 3 generations of Harrison men, reflected the station's gaslight as Jake checked the bearing toward his homestead one final time. No horses were available for rent at such an early hour, forcing Jake to begin the 15-mile walk to his valley in darkness. His military training served him well as he navigated by starlight and memory, following wagon tracks that were barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. Each step carried him closer to an encounter that might already be too late, but stopping to rest felt like admitting defeat before the battle was truly lost. The weight of his traveling bag became unbearable after the first 5 miles, forcing Jake to abandon everything except the compass, his father's pocket watch, and the cavalry saber that had somehow become essential to his identity. He cached the bag beneath a distinctive boulder formation that he could relocate later, if later mattered, if there was still reason to collect possessions and continue living in a world without Patches. Dawn found Jake halfway to his destination, his clothing soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. His legs ached with the steady rhythm of forced marching, but his pace never slowed. Military training had taught him to push through physical discomfort when missions depended on endurance, and no mission in his experience had carried stakes as personal as this desperate race against time. The familiar landmarks of his valley appeared gradually in the growing light, the twin peaks that marked the northern boundary, the stand of cottonwoods where he'd often stopped to rest during cattle drives, the creek crossing where he and Patches had shared countless morning conversations. Each sight renewed Jake's determination, while intensifying his fear that he might be returning to an empty landscape where his companion's presence existed only in memory. Smoke, rising from Ben Mackenzie's chimney, provided the first sign of human activity, and Jake altered his course to approach the neighboring homestead directly. His legs trembled with exhaustion as he covered the final half-mile, but adrenaline sustained him through sheer force of will. Ben emerged from his cabin as Jake approached, his expression mixing surprise with the somber resignation of someone who'd been expecting this moment for hours. "Jake," Ben said simply, his weathered face revealing more than words could convey. "You made good time." "Is he—" Jake began, but found himself unable to complete the question that would determine whether his desperate journey had served any purpose beyond demonstrating devotion. "Still breathing, but barely," Ben replied. "I've got him in the barn where it's warm. The veterinary surgeon from town did what he could, but the injuries are extensive. Internal damage from being caught under the equipment." Ben led Jake toward the barn with the careful pace of someone who understood that the next few minutes would be among the most significant in another man's life. Jake's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached the building where Patches lay dying, victim of loyalty that had driven him to attempt what no animal should have survived. The barn's interior was dim, despite the lanterns Ben had placed around Patches' makeshift bed of clean straw. Jake's companion lay on his side, breathing with the shallow, labored rhythm of a creature whose body was systematically shutting down. Bandages covered wounds that spoke of violent contact with unforgiving machinery, while the donkey's usually alert eyes remained closed in exhausted unconsciousness. Jake dropped to his knees beside Patches, his hand instinctively moving to stroke the familiar grey neck. The donkey's coat felt cold and damp, lacking the vital warmth that had always been present during their years together. At Jake's touch, Patches' eyes opened slightly, struggling to focus on the human face that had become the center of his world. "I'm here, partner," Jake whispered, his voice breaking with emotion he'd suppressed during the long journey home. "I came back as soon as I heard. I'm sorry I left you. I'm sorry this happened." Ben retreated to give them privacy, understanding that the reunion between man and animal deserved the dignity of solitude. Jake remained kneeling beside Patches, his hand maintaining gentle contact while he struggled to find words adequate for the moment. How could he explain to a dying animal that family duty had seemed more important than animal companionship? How could he communicate the depth of regret that consumed him now? Patches' breathing seemed to steady slightly at Jake's presence as if the familiar scent and voice provided comfort that veterinary medicine couldn't offer. The donkey's eyes, though dulled by pain and approaching death, still held the remarkable intelligence that had made their communication possible throughout their partnership. Jake saw recognition there, and something that might have been forgiveness. The railroad people came through, Jake found himself saying, needing to fill the silence with familiar conversation, even though he wasn't certain how much Patches could understand. They're going to change everything in the valley. Maybe it's time for both of us to move on, find somewhere new to start over. But even as he spoke of future possibilities, Jake understood that Patch's injuries were too severe for recovery. The donkey's labored breathing and the veterinary surgeon's grim assessment left no room for false hope. This wasn't a temporary setback that could be overcome through careful nursing and determination. This was death approaching with the implacable certainty that Jake had witnessed too many times during his military service. The morning sun streamed through the barn's single window, illuminating dust motes that danced above Patch's still form. Jake remembered similar moments during the war, sitting with wounded comrades whose battles were ending in ways that no amount of courage or medical attention could prevent. Then he'd offered what comfort he could while accepting the inevitable. With soldier's stoicism, now facing the loss of his closest companion, Jake discovered that age had not diminished his capacity for grief. If anything, the years of isolation had concentrated his emotional investment in this single relationship, making the approaching loss feel like a form of amputation that would leave him permanently incomplete. Patches stirred slightly, his head lifting with tremendous effort toward Jake's face. The movement required such obvious struggle that Jake immediately supported the donkey's weight, cradling the familiar head in his lap while stroking the soft ears that had swiveled toward his, voiced countless times during their years together. "Easy now," Jake murmured, using the same gentle tone he'd employed during their daily routines. "Don't try to move, just rest. I'm not going anywhere this time." The promise felt sacred, a commitment that transcended the practical realities of life and death. Jake had abandoned Patches once in pursuit of family obligations, but he would not repeat that mistake. Whatever time remained to them would be spent together, honoring the bond that had sustained both of them through isolation and hardship. Ben appeared in the doorway carrying 2 cups of coffee, his tactful presence offering support without intrusion. Jake accepted the warm drink gratefully, realizing that he'd consumed nothing since leaving the train depot hours earlier. The coffee's heat and caffeine provided temporary restoration to a body depleted by desperate travel and emotional strain. "How long?" Jake asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Hard to say," Ben replied honestly. "Could be hours, could be longer. Animals sometimes hang on when they've got reason to keep fighting." Jake understood what Ben wasn't saying directly, that Patches had been waiting for this reunion, that the donkey's remarkable constitution was being sustained by loyalty that transcended physical limitations. The recognition made Jake's chest tight with emotions he'd learned to suppress during decades of frontier solitude. As morning advanced toward afternoon, Jake maintained his vigil beside Patches, occasionally speaking quietly about shared memories and future plans that would never be realized. The donkey's breathing grew increasingly shallow, but his eyes remained open and aware, focused on Jake's face with the unwavering attention that had characterized their relationship from its beginning. Jake's father's compass lay beside them in the straw, its brass surface reflecting the barn's golden light. The instrument had guided 3 generations of Harrison men through difficult journeys, but no amount of navigation skill could chart a course through the geography of loss and love that Jake was exploring now. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the mountain peaks when Patches' condition took a turn that everyone had been expecting, but no one had wanted to acknowledge. Patches' final act of love came not with dramatic gesture, but with the quiet determination that had characterized their entire relationship. As his breathing grew increasingly labored, the dying donkey struggled to lift his head one last time, his dark eyes seeking something beyond Jake's immediate presence. With tremendous effort, Patches turned his muzzle toward Jake's coat pocket, where the familiar bulge of his father's compass created a small irregularity in the fabric. Jake initially misunderstood the movement, thinking Patches might be seeking comfort or trying to communicate pain. But the donkey's persistent focus on the pocket, despite his obvious weakness, gradually revealed a different intention. Patches was remembering their daily ritual, the morning routine where Jake would share his breakfast biscuit, always offered, from the same pocket where he kept his most treasured possessions. "You want your biscuit, don't you, partner?" Jake whispered, his voice thick with understanding and approaching grief. He reached into his pocket, past his father's compass, searching for any remnant of food that might satisfy this final request. His fingers found only crumbs from the journey, but he gathered them carefully and offered them to Patches on his open palm. The donkey's response shattered every emotional barrier Jake had constructed during 30 years of frontier solitude. Instead of accepting the meager offering for himself, Patches used his last reserves of strength to push the crumbs back toward Jake with his muzzle. The gesture was unmistakable. After a lifetime of accepting Jake's offerings, Patches was trying to share his final meal, to give back the kindness that had sustained their partnership for 5 years. Jake's vision blurred as tears he hadn't should since childhood welled up and spilled down his weathered cheeks. This simple act of reciprocal generosity revealed the depth of affection that had grown between them, a bond that transcended the usual boundaries between human and animal. Patches understood that Jake had made a desperate journey to be present for these final moments, and the donkey was trying to offer what comfort he could in return. "Oh, you beautiful, stubborn fool!" Jake sobbed, cradling Patches' head more securely against his chest. "You don't need to take care of me. That's not your job anymore." But Patches persisted, his weakening movement still focused on pushing the crumbs toward Jake's lips, insisting on this final act of care even as his own life ebbed away. The reversal of their usual roles, the animal caring for the human instead of the other way around, spoke to something profound about the nature of love and loyalty that Jake had never fully comprehended. Ben Mackenzie stood in the barn doorway, witnessing this extraordinary moment between man and animal with the reverent silence it deserved. He'd seen many creatures die during his years of ranching, but nothing had prepared him for the depth of emotion and connection playing out in his barn. Jake's tears fell freely now, landing on Patch's gray coat like drops of rain on drought-stricken earth. "I understand, partner," Jake managed to say through his tears. "You're trying to tell me you love me too, aren't you? You're trying to take care of me one last time." Patch's eyes, growing dimmer but still focused on Jake's face, seemed to confirm his human companion's interpretation. The donkey had spent 5 years accepting Jake's care and protection, learning to trust in the daily offerings of food and affection that had made their isolation bearable. Now, faced with the approach of death, Patches was attempting to reverse those roles, to offer what little he had left to the human who had risked everything to be present for this farewell. Jake accepted the crumbs that Patches continued to push toward him, understanding that this wasn't about food, but about the completion of a circle of love that had sustained both of them through seasons of hardship and loneliness. The simple act of sharing became a communion that transcended words or conventional expressions of affection. As Patch's efforts grew weaker, Jake gathered the remaining crumbs and ate them slowly, making sure the donkey could see that his gift had been accepted and appreciated. The taste was nothing special, stale bread mixed with dust from desperate travel, but Jake had never consumed anything more precious or meaningful. "Thank you," Jake whispered against Patch's ear, "for everything, for being my friend when I thought I didn't need friends, for teaching me how to love something again, for showing me what loyalty really means." Patch's breathing had become almost imperceptible, but his eyes remained fixed on Jake's face with an intensity that suggested he was using his final moments to memorize the features of the human who had become his world. Jake understood that he was witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the death of an animal, but the conclusion of a relationship that had transformed both participants in ways neither had expected. The barn fell silent, except for the distant sounds of afternoon, settling over the valley, Birds calling, wind stirring the trees, cattle lowing in distant pastures. Ben remained in the doorway, understanding that his role was simply to bear witness to something he might never see again. A bond between species that revealed possibilities most people never imagined. Jake continued stroking Patch's neck with gentle consistency, maintaining physical contact that seemed to provide comfort to both of them as the inevitable moment approached. Patch's final breath came as gently as morning mist rising from the valley creek, a soft exhalation that seemed to carry with it all the contentment of their 5 years together. His eyes, which had maintained their focus on Jake's face throughout the long afternoon, gradually lost their remarkable intelligence and became simply brown glass, reflecting the barn's golden light. Jake felt the exact moment when life departed, not through any dramatic change, but through the subtle absence of the vital presence that had animated his companion for so many years. Jake continued stroking Patch's neck for several minutes after. The donkey's death, unable to accept immediately that their partnership had truly ended. The grey coat felt different beneath his fingers, still warm, still familiar, but lacking the subtle tension of muscles that had once responded to his touch. With affectionate recognition, Patches had become a beautiful shell, empty of the spirit that had made him extraordinary. "He's gone," Ben said quietly from the doorway, his voice carrying the gentle finality of someone experienced in recognizing death's arrival. "Peaceful as I've ever seen. He waited for you, Jake. He held on until you could get here." Jake nodded, without speaking, his throat too constricted for words. The tears that had begun with Patch's final gesture of sharing continued to flow, carrying with them 30 years of accumulated grief and isolation that had never found proper expression. He wept for his companion, but also for his father, for the war dead who had never received adequate mourning, for the young man he'd once been who had believed that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. His father's compass lay in the straw beside them, its brass surface now reflecting not Jake's desperate need for direction, but the steady certainty of someone who had finally understood what mattered most. The instrument had guided Harrison men through physical journeys across difficult terrain, but it had taken a donkey's dying gesture to show Jake the emotional territory he'd been avoiding for decades. "I need to bury him properly," Jake said. Finally, his voice rough from emotion. "Somewhere he can see the valley, somewhere the morning sun will find him." Ben nodded with understanding that went beyond mere neighborly courtesy. "I'll help. Got a spot picked out already. That little rise behind your cabin, where he used to stand when he was watching for you to come home." The location was perfect, Jake realized. He'd often noticed Patches positioning himself on that slight elevation. When daily chores separated them, the donkey maintaining patient vigil until Jake returned to their immediate vicinity. Patches had claimed that spot as his own observation post, his way of keeping watch over their shared territory and the human who had become essential to his sense of security. They worked together through the remainder of the afternoon, digging, a grave that was deeper and more carefully prepared than most humans received. Jake insisted on perfection in every detail, from the precise dimensions of the excavation to the arrangement of stones that would mark the site permanently. This wasn't simply disposal of animal remains. This was the creation of a monument to a relationship that had transformed both participants. As they worked, Ben shared stories about his own attachments to particular animals over the years, understanding that Jake needed to hear that such deep connections weren't unusual or shameful. Among people who lived close to the land, the conversation helped Jake process his grief while honoring the significance of what he'd lost. The sun was setting behind the mountain peaks when they finally laid Patches to rest, wrapped in the same military blanket that had once kept Jake warm during his cavalry service. The blue wool, faded by decades of use, seemed appropriate for a creature who had served his human companion with military devotion and unwavering loyalty. Jake stood beside the grave as Ben offered a simple prayer. For all creatures who had served mankind faithfully and deserved recognition for their contributions to human happiness. The words were few but heartfelt, acknowledging that some bonds transcended the boundaries between species and deserved commemoration regardless of their unconventional nature. As darkness settled over the valley, Jake remained at the graveside, while Ben returned to his own cabin. The stars emerged one by one in the clear mountain air, providing the same reliable navigation that had comforted Jake during countless nights of frontier solitude. But tonight, their steady light illuminated a transformed man who understood that love, however painful its inevitable conclusion, was the force that made life worth living. His father's compass caught starlight as Jake finally prepared to leave. The graveside, its needle pointing steadily toward magnetic north with the same consistency Patches had shown in pointing Jake toward emotional truth. The instrument would continue to guide Harrison men through future journeys, but it would carry new meaning now, a reminder that the most important navigation involved finding one's way back to connection and compassion rather than maintaining distance and independence. Jake touched the simple stone marker they'd placed at the head of Patch's grave, then began walking toward his cabin through familiar darkness. Each step carried him not away from love, but deeper into understanding of what love truly meant and what it demanded of those brave enough to risk its complications. Behind him, Patches rested beneath stars that would shine on the valley long. After Jake himself was gone, their light a permanent benediction on a friendship that had taught both man and animal the transformative power of loyalty, freely given and gratefully received. 3 months after Patch's death, Jake Harrison stood in the parlor of his family's Ohio farmhouse, wearing his best suit and holding his father's compass, while Martha introduced him to grandchildren who bore the Harrison name, but knew nothing of the uncle who had disappeared into the Western Territories before their birth. The reunion he'd missed during his father's final hours had finally taken place during the autumn harvest, when family obligations and railroad schedules aligned to make the journey possible. The compass had become Jake's most treasured possession, not for its practical value as a navigation instrument, but for its symbolic connection to 3 generations of men who had struggled to balance duty with desire, obligation with individual happiness. His father's grave in the family cemetery bore fresh flowers that Martha tended with the same devotion she'd shown during the old man's final illness. And Jake had spent hours there, conducting the conversations he'd avoided for 30 years. Martha had welcomed him with characteristic grace, never mentioning the circumstances that had prevented his arrival in time for their father's funeral. Her letters over the intervening months had gradually revealed the family history Jake had missed, marriages, births, deaths, and small triumphs that connected him to a network of relationships he'd never quite abandoned, despite decades of silence. But Ohio no longer felt like home to Jake, if it ever truly had. The landscape that had shaped his childhood seemed diminished after years of Western vastness, and the social conventions of settled communities felt constraining after decades of frontier independence. He'd fulfilled his obligation to family memory and received forgiveness he hadn't dared hope for. But his heart remained in the Wyoming Valley, where Patches lay beneath stones arranged with military precision. The railroad company's final offer for his homestead had been generous enough to fund a comfortable retirement anywhere Jake chose to settle. But comfort had never been his primary concern, and retirement suggested a completion of purpose that didn't match his internal sense of having more to accomplish. At 60, Jake felt more alive and emotionally engaged than he had since his youth, awakened by grief to possibilities he'd spent decades avoiding. Ben Mackenzie's letters provided regular updates about the valley's transformation under railroad development. The isolated wilderness that had sheltered Jake for 3 decades was disappearing beneath tracks and telegraph lines, settlements, and commercial enterprises that would bring prosperity and convenience at the cost of the solitude that had once seemed essential to Jake's survival, but Ben's most significant news concerned a development that had surprised everyone familiar with the valley's history. A family of homesteaders had requested permission to build their cabin near Patch's grave, drawn by the sight's commanding view of the surrounding landscape and its access to fresh water from the spring that emerged nearby. The family's children, Ben reported, had discovered Patch's grave during their initial exploration of the property and had begun leaving small offerings there: wild flowers, interesting stones, simple drawings created by young hands that understood intuitively that the site marked something important. Their parents, immigrants from Germany, seeking opportunity in the American wilderness, had asked Ben to convey their respect for whatever lay buried there and their commitment to maintaining the grave's dignity. Jake's response had been immediate and clear. He would deed the gravesite and surrounding acreage to the family as a gift, with the understanding that Patch's resting place would be preserved and honored by people who appreciated the connection between land and memory, between human dreams and the animals who shared them. The legal arrangements had been completed through correspondence, but Jake felt compelled to witness the transfer personally and to meet the family who would become guardians of his most precious memories. The journey back to Wyoming carried none of the desperate urgency of his previous cross-country travel, but it represented a pilgrimage toward understanding rather than simply returning to familiar territory. The train that carried Jake west toward his final visit to the valley passed through landscape that had been transformed by the same railroad development that was reshaping his own small corner of the frontier. Towns that hadn't existed during his earlier travels now boasted hotels and telegraph offices, churches and schools that marked civilization's steady advance across territories that had once seemed impossibly remote. Jake's fellow passengers included families seeking new opportunities, businessmen pursuing commercial ventures, and adventurers drawn by the same combination of freedom and challenge that had originally attracted him to the West. Their conversations revealed optimism and determination that reminded Jake of his own younger self, before experience had taught him the complexity of dreams and the price of independence. As the train approached the depot nearest his former homestead, Jake reflected on the circular nature of his journey. He'd left Ohio as a young man, seeking escape from family obligations and social expectations, had found solitude and healing in the wilderness, had learned to love through his relationship with Patches, and had finally returned to family connection. Enriched by understanding of what really mattered in human relationships, the compass his father had carried west in 1832 now pointed Jake toward a different kind of navigation, not away from human connection, but toward a more mature engagement with the responsibilities and rewards of love. Patches had taught him that emotional investment, however painful its inevitable conclusion, was what distinguished meaningful existence from mere survival. The German family that greeted Jake at Patch's grave embodied the same pioneering spirit that had driven 3 generations of Harrison men to seek new territories and fresh possibilities. Their children, blonde and curious and unafraid of the weathered stranger who had traveled across the continent to visit an animal's burial site, reminded Jake of the resilience and hope that made frontier life possible despite its hardships. Standing beside the carefully maintained grave, while autumn sunlight slanted across the valley that had sheltered him for 30 years, Jake finally understood the lesson Patches had been trying to teach him through their years together, that love, freely given and gratefully received, was the only treasure that increased when shared, the only investment that paid dividends long after the principle had been surrendered to time and change. The compass pointed steadily north, its needle unwavering despite the emotional magnitude of Jake's farewell to the valley and the companion who had made it home. Tomorrow would bring new journeys and different destinations, but Jake would carry with him the quiet confidence of a man who had learned to love without reservation, and had discovered that such love however briefly held, was sufficient to illuminate a lifetime.